If you look back in history, African Americans has had a huge impact in the music industry and also a huge influence to music in general. Starting with the blues, born in the South, the blues is an African American derived music form that recognized the pain of lost love and injustice, and gave expression to the victory of outlasting a broken heart and facing down adversity. Blues is the foundation of jazz, as well as the prime source of rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and country music. The blues is still evolving and is still widely played today. Blues has the biggest influence any music genre had on jazz. The song I Left My Baby by Jimmy with the Count Basie Band is a good example of showing how blues and jazz go together. Blues is what set the ground rules for American popular music. Some things jazz and blues brought to the table were pulsing rhythms, melodic hooks, vivid images, timeless stories, and exciting performance practices. We definitely see this in modern day music, in all genres that are played in America. Without the invention of jazz and blues, we would not have the music we love today. Many jazz and blues artists from the 1920s has been a huge influence to jazz and music beyond. Billie Holiday was a revolutionary famous singer who revolutionized the female singer career and had a thriving and successful career before she lost to a drug addiction. Her song Lady Day was possibly the most popular song of the 1920s. Duke Ellington is a significant jazz musician. Born on April 29, 1899, he began studying the piano at the age of 7 and started playing jazz as a teenager. Billy Strayhorn stated, "Ellington plays the piano, but his real instrument is his band. Each member of his band is to him a distinctive tone color and set of emotions, which he mixes with others equally distinctive to produce a third thing, which I like to call the Ellington effect." Trumpeter, bandleader, and composer John Burks Dizzy Gillespie was born on October 21, 1917, in Cheraw, South Carolina. He got his first music lesson from his father and took off from there. He moved to New York City in 1937 and met musicians such as Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker. Together they experimented with jazz and came up with the beep boop sound. Louis Armstrong was probably one of the most important figures in American history. Louis Armstrong was known as Satchmo or Pops and was an incredible influential jazz trumpet player and singer. He is recognized as being a major influence in modern jazz. His singing influenced singers such as Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby. Louis Armstrong is possibly known as the #1 influential jazz musician. As the famous African American founded genres spread throughout America, it influenced both white and black men alike. Benny Goodman is a perfect example of the famous white jazz musician. His concert at Carnegie Hall was considered to be one of the most important live shows of all time. Buddy Rich, a famous jazz drummer and composer, is also a good example of a famous white jazz musician. In fact, they have an annual memorial concert in honor of him called the Buddy Rich Memorial. These famous artists of jazz and blues are what set the ground rules for future musicians of all genres alike.
Rhythm and blues was brought about by African American slaves on the early plantations as early as the 1830s. It was a way for them to escape their everyday lives of the cotton fields. It was an upbeat music, more of the club dance and swinging genre, and they usually used saxophones and guitars or whatever they could scrape by with. Rhythm and blues began in the early 1920s and embraced a few different genres such as jump blues and club blues. R&B provided the single greatest influence on popular music worldwide for much of the second half of the 20th century. The influence has been traced in forms of rock, country, and jazz. R&B is known for its predominantly vocal genre, featuring a soloist singer accompanied by a small group including piano, guitar, acoustic bass, drums, and a tenor saxophone. Its harmonies and structure are drawn from 12-bar blues and 30 quadruple meter. R&B originated from the sociological, industrial, and technological changes that took place in the United States just prior to and during World War II. It was first coined in 1949 by Jerry Wexler, who became prominent with Atlantic Records. Wexler used the term rhythm and blues as a synonym for black rock and roll. With Wexler being located in the Windy City, it was estimated from 1940 to 1944, more than 50,000 African Americans from Mississippi alone headed for Chicago. They paid about $15 for the day-long trip on the Illinois Central Railroad. This was the staple that encouraged Southern sharecroppers to migrate to the north. One of the artists who followed, Muddy Waters, who grew up in Mississippi, began to merge his Delta influences with the urban environment of Chicago. With the art of rhythm and blues booming in Chicago, it began paving the way for many other artists to follow. These select few who decided to pack up and leave behind everything they know, some of the big names we recall are B.B. King, born in Mississippi in 1925, known worldwide as one of the top guitarists of all time. King based his play on fluid string bending and shimmering vibrato that would influence virtually every electric guitarist that followed. With such an impact on the R&B movement, he earned the nickname the King of Blues. Another we would recall would be Elmore James, also known as the King of the Side Guitar. Born in Mississippi in 1918, James was noted for his use of loud amplification and his stirring voice. These are only some of the men who helped create the wonderful music we have come to know as rhythm and blues. With their hard work and passion, it has helped mold countless music genres that we still listen to in the 21st century. They are the original pioneers of music.
The rhythm and blues of Muddy Waters and other urban blues artists served as the foundation for early rock and rollers such as Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, and the Beatles. Additionally, Little Richard and Chuck Berry were inventors and pioneers for new sounds and styles that would forever change rock and roll.
Starting in the late 1940s, the artist Muddy Waters, who played the new electrified music called rhythm and blues, served as the foundation for rock and roll. Stars such as Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and many other rock and rollers to come. A subtle blend of African and European traditions provided the necessary elements and inspiration for the birth of rock and roll and the success of Chuck Berry and Little Richard. Bo Diddley was one of rock and roll's most revered pioneers. Bo Diddley became famous for his reverb-heavy guitar sound and his famous Bo Diddley beat. As a musician for Chess Records, Bo Diddley was able to create sounds that could now be harnessed with a new sound on vinyl. This greatly helped in making popular the guitar-driven, amplified blues which reflected post-war America and formed the bedrock of rock and roll. Little Richard and Chuck Berry were significantly younger and wilder than most R&B performers of their time in the 1950s and 60s, became heroes to white teens who had discovered rhythm and blues. As a rock and roll pioneer and musical icon, Little Richard's distinctive brand of high-energy rock and roll helped define the genre and influenced everyone from contemporaries like Jerry Lee Lewis and Fats Domino to disciples like Beatles and Elton John. Little Richard dressed in flashy clothing with a slicked-up hairstyle and makeup and delivered his music accompanied by a wild stage show. John Lennon once said that if you renamed rock and roll, you might as well call it Chuck Berry. The legendary rocker is the genre's first true guitar hero. His fiery licks and leads made the instrument the defining sound of rock during an era where many rockers still played piano. And almost every rock guitarist has borrowed from his playing style. Of the female pioneers of rock and roll, Tina Turner is arguably the definitive female rock vocalist. In the 1960s, Tina's raspy throat singing and sexually charged stage presence paved the way for aggressive female rockers like Janis Joplin and Chrissie Hynde, and she was one of the biggest chart toppers of the 1980s. Of these early rock and roll pioneers, many executives complained about successful, undermined African American rockers and their music. Even some leaders of their music industry personally disliked rock and roll. To reverse this trend, larger companies signed white artists to copy or cover the songs of African American artists, sometimes sanitizing the lyrics. Business people at the head of the major corporations suppressed the independence in their African American performers. The McGuire sisters' copy of Sincerely, for example, sold 6 times as many records as the Moonglows original. In 1955 and 1956, covers by white artists such as Pat Boone climbed to the top of the charts, while most African American artists received little fame or money for their pioneering efforts. Artists such as Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Bo Diddley were forced to tour constantly to make a living at the time.
With me, there had to be a copy, complained Bo Diddley 20 years later. They wouldn't buy me, but they would buy a white copy of me. All in all, many African American artists developed the music and got ripped off, and the glory and the money goes to the white artists. Due to the irresistible force of social and cultural change in the 1960s, a man by the name of Berry Gordy took the lead in establishing a new form of music that African Americans could dominate. Gordy, sounding much like Martin Luther King Jr., created a music empire that exemplified the peaceful integration advocated by King and reflected the progress of the civil rights movement. The Detroit-based company became a major force in popular music from late 1964 to 1967, when civil rights petitions won a series of significant legislatures. At a time when civil rights of African Americans began to be recognized, Motown became the first African American owned label that consistently and successfully groomed packages, marketed and sold the music of African American youth to the white masses. One of the greatest rock guitarists of all time, Jimi Hendrix, the left-handed genius, reinvented the way players approached the instrument. Coming from a poor background of both African American and Cherokee descent, and from a broken home in Seattle, Hendrix reflected the mood of the late 1960s youth through a gut-wrenching electric psychedelic blues. Additionally, he was one of the greatest songwriters of the rock era and was an innovator in studio production and technique. In only 3 years of recording, he forever altered guitar in recording. He delivered a loud, angry electric blues that captured the violence of the era. A true legend. Moving into the 1980s and 90s, several African American artists started shaping a new sound for themselves. Among them is Prince Rogers Nelson. While he has dabbled in many genres throughout his amazing career, there's no denying that Prince is among the greatest rock stars in the history of the genre. His classical period features some of the most definitive music of the 1980s and 90s, and he influenced rock, pop, funk, and dance music like no one else of his era. He has produced 10 platinum albums and 30 top 40 singles during his career. He has written several hundred songs and produces and records his own music for his own music label.
Had the civil rights movement led to real integration, rap music might have never been created. In the 1970s and 80s, while soul became increasingly more popular, something else was being formed in the black inner city of New York, more specifically the Bronx.
That something was rap, which came out of dance party and clubs overseen by a DJ or disc jockey who spun records. The MC, or master of ceremonies, was the other key figure in early rap, in charge of vocalizing a rapid-fire string of rhymed phrases. Also known by another term, hip-hop, the two are often used interchangeably, although hip-hop refers to the larger culture. Not everybody enjoyed this bold new genre. One describes their reaction to first hearing rap. I realized to my horror that rap music, seemingly without melody, sensibility, instruments, verse, or harmony, music with no end, beginning, or middle, music that doesn't even seem to be music, rules the world. Rapper's Delight, a party song by the Sugar Hill Gang, brought rap to a wider audience in 1979. In 1982, The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five brought political topics into the new genre. While most early rap was focused on dancing and partying, political and social themes became increasingly more important in the late 1980s, notably in the group Public Enemy. By the 1990s, however, a new trend became dominant, gangsta rap, fueled largely by the crack epidemic, which devastated black communities and led to an increased criminal element influencing the music. One of the most influential rap artists of all time was a rapper known as Tupac. Tupac was an African-American rapper and actor. He sold over 75 million records worldwide, making him one of the best-selling music artists of all time. And MTV ranked him at number 2 on their list of the greatest MCs of all time, and Rolling Stone named him the 86th greatest artist of all time. His double-disc album All Eyes on Me is one of the best-selling hip-hop albums of all time. Tupac began his career as a roadie, backup dancer, and MC for the alternative hip-hop group Digital Underworld, eventually branching off as a solo artist. The themes of most of his music revolve around the violence and hardship in inner cities, racism, and other social problems. Both of his parents and several other members of his family were members of the Black Panther Party, whose ideals were reflected in his songs. On September 7, 1996, Tupac was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was taken to the hospital where he died 6 days later. Although Tupac was killed, his music has lived on and influenced artists today in an unprecedented way. Rap, meanwhile, has been declared past its prime, notably by Nas or Nasir Jones, who proclaimed Hip Hop is Dead as the title of his 2006 album. Yet the music continues to evolve, with new branches springing up, for instance, in the appearance of a distinct Southern style. Nelson George explains the connection between rap and American youth. The truth is that hip-hop, in its many forms, has reflected and internalized our society's woes so evocatively that it has grown from minority expression to mainstream appreciation. Like past rebellious genres, from jazz to rock and roll, rap has appeared to teenage feelings of isolation in mainstream society. It joins a host of African American styles that go into remission but reappear, crossbreed, thrive, and grow, often at the most unexpected times.